All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me today. I'm glad to come talk to you. But first, I must start by apologizing to Dr. Scordato and you. Michelle asked me a long time ago to do these presentations, and I agreed, thought it was a wonderful idea. I always love talking to students. And then, completely like a doofus, scheduled time away with my family right on top of our classes. So Dr. Scortato is being kind enough to let me YouTube into you guys with a quick discussion today about sampling and what we can do with that. So let me start with little bit of a little bit about myself. My name is Mike Gibbons. I'm the associate provost at school. I oversee institutional research and data strategy, among other things, and I have a PhD in sociology. My degree's from Notre Dame, from from when Christ was a boy. And uh, not only do I have 20 years of teaching and research and administration experience in universities, I also have 3 years of strategic marketing research consulting for the pharmaceutical industry. I worked for a small boutique firm in the suburbs of Philadelphia. We did custom research, one-off stuff for pharmaceutical brands that you're familiar with. And so some of what you're going to hear today comes from my research experience, and some of this is going to come from straight up textbook stuff. But Dr. Scordato asked if we could talk about sampling, so we will. So the first thing that I want to say is that sampling sampling is a subset of the population that you want to talk to. When you decide you want to do research on a group of people, often it is unrealistic to think you can talk to all of the people, and so you choose a sample of the people you're going to talk to. If you want to say something about 100 people, but you only want to do 10 interviews, you have to pick 10 people to talk to. That's your sample. Regardless of if you're doing qualitative interview-based research or quantitative statistical-based research, you're going to have to sample. If you're not sampling, if you actually talk to the whole population, that's what a census is. And so, for instance, the U.S. does a census every 10 years. It's written into the Constitution. It's how we allocate resources, senators, representatives, all sorts of things. And a census, by definition, means you have talked to or surveyed every single one of the people in that population. It turns out that this is very hard to do. Some people don't want to get found. Some people are very hard to get. And so even the U.S. Census, which is backed by plenty of money and the best researchers we have in the United States that the government can buy, we still fall short of a proper census and have to try and figure out who we're missing. And it ends up being a really tricky question. So the gold standard for a sample is a random sample. A random sample technically means that every single person in the population has the same percentage chance of being chosen to participate in your research. So if we are looking at a population of 100, to use the earlier example, and we want to use 10 people to talk to, then each of the 100 people has to have a 10% chance of being chosen if it's going to be a random sample. There are a lot of different ways of doing a random sample. If you've got just a list of people, it could be alphabetical. If from my office, if we were looking at students, you could line them up by their 983 numbers. But you get your list of people, you find out how many there are. If it's 1,000 people and you want a sample of 10% of 100, then Um, you're going to take every 10th person on that list of 1,000. You line them up, either alphabetically or 983s by some sort of logic. You use a random number generator to get the first number you're going to start with, and then you count every 10th person from there. So it sounds really straightforward. The problem you're going to bump into, there are a number of problems you can bump into. One, if there's some sort of internal logic to the list that lines up with your sampling frequency, like every 10th person, that could be a problem. Which is why I use something like 983s. Those are random. Alphabetical by name, that's random. But that's one of the things that you have to look for. Another problem you can bump into, aside from the frequency of the list, what was I going to say? Well, we'll get back to that. What do you do when one of the people that you try and contact doesn't respond, right? So if we're going to call 100 people out of the 1,000, and we pick a random number to start with, and then just start going 1, 2, 3, 10th, 10th, 10th. When one of those people doesn't answer the phone, that's actually a bigger problem than it seems like. And here's why. Some people will answer their phone and some won't. If we're calling and someone doesn't answer the phone, then and we just replace that person, then we start perhaps introducing a little bit of bias into that. Can you imagine that there are people who are more likely or less likely to answer the phone when that's not random? I sure can. Back when they did landline calling, and younger people had cell phones and weren't getting landlines in their homes, you could easily end up with a sample. If you just replaced the people who didn't answer the phone, you could easily end up with a sample that skewed very heavily towards older folks. You're calling people with landlines. Young people don't have landlines, so you're not going to get them in your sample. All of a sudden, your sample is not random. It's biased towards older people. Even in today's world, where everyone has cell phones and researchers will use cell lines, still, young people, they often don't answer the phone at all. They use their phone for texting and 1,000 other things. Older people will answer their phone. So again, your sample is going to tend towards the older. That introduces a certain amount of bias. There's all sorts of other bias too. There's a famous election a long time ago where one of the national papers, based on their polling, ran the presses and said that candidate A won the presidential election. They published the newspaper, they sent it out, and then the very next day they were wrong, wrong, wrong. And the reason was they were doing telephone sampling at a time when not everyone had phones in their homes. How did it work out? People who were more well-to-do had phones, and so they answered. They said who they were voting for, and the newspaper went ahead and made their prediction based on that. Even in today's world, if somehow or other if you're just using politics as an example, if you end up asking more well-to-do families, the chance that you're going to end up with someone with a Republican skewed sample, it's imaginable, right? Same with older and younger. Older people may well be more likely to vote Republican, and so if you're doing political research and you're not allowing for that bias in your understanding that, how do I say this? You're introducing bias. Now, if we were aiming for a perfectly random sample, and some places do, the answer to that would be you don't let people off the hook for not answering their phone. You call them back, you call them back, you call them back. In the days when sampling was done mostly by mail, you'd send follow-up postcards every week until finally they sent the research back in. If you ran out of, if you sent 6 weeks worth of postcards, you might send a researcher out to their house to knock on their door and say, hey, would you please do our survey? So that's kind of a problem. So there are problems with random sampling that we can talk about. I'll talk about in a little bit, but these examples hint at that. The bigger the bigger concern. Well, before we do that, if we are able to do a random sample, then we can say that our research is generalizable. And what that means is, if we do the sample correctly and it's a random sample, we can estimate from the research in our sample to what the population you're actually talking about is. That's why random sampling is so important, or getting a sample as close to random as you possibly can, because ultimately you're not doing the research to say something about the 10 people or the 100 people you spoke to. You want to say something about the larger group that people represents, whether it's polling research, who's going to win the presidential election, to product research, which physicians are going to choose which drugs. The closer you can get to random, the more you can say these research are generalizable to the larger population. There's some math behind that, which you may or may not be interested in, but it essentially has to do with the central limit theorem. And if you're interested in that, have Dr. Scordato hit me up and I'll do a follow-up on this for that. But essentially, random sampling is what allows social science to be scientific. Once you start getting away from a random sample, you start having all sorts of problems that have to be understood. Random samples are tremendously difficult to do, so in reality, most samples are compromises between what the gold standard is and what we can really afford and take the time to actually do. Okay. Now, as you can imagine, so what are some of the problems that you run into with random sampling? Well, I already alluded to these. The first and biggest is it may not honestly be realistic. In today's world where, my mom reads the Wall Street Journal and watches the news on CNN or the local 6 o'clock news. My children get their news from TikTok, I think, and they think Facebook is for old people. I don't know how you would put together any way of recruiting that's going to get and reach both of those populations in any way, shape, or form. The kids may respond to texting, they may respond to something else. They're not going to answer a landline. Grandma, she'll answer the phone sometimes, but she's not going to respond to texts if she were to even get them. I think she knows how to text. So to try and get a random sample that's going to be able to say something about a 20-something and an 80-something, it's just not realistic, even if you had all the money in the world. The second thing is, even when it's realistically doable with unlimited resources, the amount of time and energy it takes to make something happen means you're not going to be able to. Like, it's just simply too expensive. So, yes, we send out a call. We get the people on the phone who answer, but then the ones who don't answer, we got to keep calling them. The fact that they didn't answer their phone in the first place means they may never answer the phone. So now we got to try and find their mail address. Maybe we start with email. We send them a bunch of emails. Then we got to find their mailing address, send them a bunch of mails, and then paper mail, and then send somebody out to talk to them, knock on their door, and try and answer their questions. It's just not going to happen. The second part about that is often when you're trying to do this kind of research, the time frames are short enough, and the budgets, like, it's not just a budget problem, it's a time frame problem. If this last election was particularly brutal, if Biden's people didn't like something Trump said and they needed to find a way to message back against that, they don't have time to try and survey all of the Republicans that they might get to be swing votes. They didn't have a chance to survey all of their Democrats that may or may not have been offended. They need to know from research done tonight on people who saw tonight's news what their feeling was, so that they can then go out and message tomorrow. So trying to do a perfectly random sample is going to be an issue. It's just not going to happen. So then part of why that's important is because how we deal with those problems, we have ways of trying to deal with those problems so that while not perfectly random, not perfectly generalizable, our research is still good enough for us to do quality academics, first of all, for the academics, and second of all, to gather actionable intelligence for the applied researchers in the world. What are a couple of examples of this? So, one of the ways, what we commonly did in pharma, the company I worked in specialized in qualitative research. Of course, we did quantitative research as well, but mostly it was probably 70% qualitative, which meant a lot of interviews. We'd go to a city, talk to physicians in a research facility. You'd have people behind the glass watching. You'd have the interviewer, the moderator doing the interview, and you'd have the researcher and someone would be in back typing it all up. Now, that gets time. That's costly. It takes a lot of time to do. So we would fly to a city, rent the research room, do 9 1-hour interviews in a day, go to the next city, and then go to the next city. So to get 25 to 30 interviews, you would have had to have paid for a lot of airlines, a lot of research facility rental, a lot of hotel rooms, a lot of man and woman power to do the interviews, do the transcriptions, do the analysis. And so if I'm just making stuff up here, but if a 30 physician interview ended up running $50,000, you can see that trying to get a really large pool is going to be prohibitively expensive, right? There were a couple of ways that we dealt with that. One was after doing the in-person interviews, we'd also do a whole bunch of telephone interviews. Well, that broadened our sample, but the telephone interviews were a little less rich, right? You can't see the person's body language. You can't have people behind the glass watching the interview. The client can't necessarily interact real time with the interviewer to say, hey, ask this physician this question, ask this physician that question. So, you're going from super rich but super expensive to still rich but a little bit less expensive and a little less rich in terms of data. But okay, so then you've got, maybe you've got 30 in-person interviews. Maybe you've got, 50 telephone interviews. So you're up to a sample of 80. And that's still not going to say really what you want to say about every physician who's like that in the world. It's going to be about these guys. So how do you deal with that? Well, the answer is you pick a stratified sample. So again, in pharma, our clients knew very well what kind of physicians use their drugs. You didn't need to get a list of all physicians and say, have you ever used this? You knew that general practitioners maybe used it. You knew rheumatologists use it. You knew dermatologists use it. And so you would pick, when you went to a city and you set up your 9 interviews, you'd say, I want 3 general practitioners, 3 dermatologists, 3 rheumatologists, and that would be your sample. The reason that worked is because you weren't waiting on the law of large numbers to draw a representational proportion of rheumatologists and dermatologists and whoever else I said, general practitioners into your sample. You knew that you had 30% 30% of this, 30% of this, and 40% of that. So you picked 3, 3, and 4 for the number of physicians you wanted. So you didn't wait for the math to work itself out, or the statistics to work itself out. You forced the sample. And when you were doing your recruit, when you were calling physicians to say, hey, would you come downtown and do an interview with us? Once you got 3 general practitioners, you stopped calling general practitioners. Once you got 3 rheumatologists, you stopped calling rheumatologists. That was probably the most common way you would deal with the sample problem, the problem that we weren't drawing people by random and letting the law of large numbers churn through and get us a representational sample. The second thing that you have to be very aware of, and this matters no matter what you're talking about, and that is bias. So as I said at the beginning, if you're trying to call people and you're using landlines, you're going to bias your sample such that your results are going to tend towards older people. If you're trying to conduct a sample by text, SMS, you're going to bias it such that you're going to get younger people. If we, in the example that I used, if we did 3 dermatologists, 3 rheumatologists, and 4 general practitioners, we controlled whatever proportional bias we might end up with, but there's room for other kinds of bias too. Let's see. One example would be, one glaring example is who's going to come, what physician, if they've got a good practice, are going to take a Tuesday off and drive downtown for a small honorarium to participate in marketing research about some pharmaceutical product. You have to ask yourself, are they doing this out of the good of their heart? Maybe they are. Are they doing it for the benefit of social science and the benefit of the pharmaceutical development? Maybe they are. Maybe they're not actually all that booked as a physician and they're coming downtown because they have free time. Well, if your research is selecting the physicians who aren't carrying heavy schedules, you may not be selecting the best physicians for your research, and you have to be aware of that. And in point of fact, we knew inside the firm that only about 30% of physicians do marketing research anywhere. So we knew when we presented to clients that, there's a lot of room to be a little bit wrong with the information that we had. Now, there's an important difference between my academic friends and my practitioner friends on that point. And that is, what do we do with this information if we know it's flawed or not perfect? It's very easy to say, well, this sample is not as good as it could be. It's not representative. And so, therefore, we should not trust it. That's a little bit easier to do if you're in the academic world, because if your sample didn't work, or if you thought your sample wasn't good enough, maybe you just ask more people. Or if you're reading somebody else's research and you say, well, that sample's, their sample is clearly flawed, then you don't have to worry about the research as much. But in the world of political research, marketing research, business strategy consulting, that's not really okay. Like I said, we would have clients drop, I don't know, a lot of money. Like I said, 30 to 50,000 on a research project that might be, 30 respondents. And even doing it as well as we could, you still are going to get all of the problems that I told you about. You're not going to get physicians who are busy. You may end up, with some of the same physicians over and over and over again if you're dealing with a very tight specialty. We would try and deal with that, but at the end of it all, our client, our business consumers, were not going to be okay with us saying, well, we interviewed 30 people, we charged you $50,000, but the sample's not perfect, so you probably can't do anything with this information anyway. Or to use the Biden and Trump example, if you're in the middle of a political debate or a political contest, and one of the candidates does something and the other candidate needs to respond by tomorrow or by 2 days, sitting and saying, well, we're not going to get a perfect sample is not, and so therefore we shouldn't do anything. It's not an answer. They need information that they can act on. And so that's where you start to say, okay, what we really need to do is to take what we've got and do our best with it. We're not going to get perfect information. This is the information we have. So what do we do with it? Well, it's like any information. If a friend tells you something, some friends, they're a little more trustworthy than others. Some friends, sometimes they, their stories get better as they tell them. So when someone tells you something, you think, well, this person, I trust them or I don't, or, their stories are usually pretty inflated. So, just shave it down a little bit. This is kind of the same way. You say, well, this is the sample we had. These are the people we talked to. These are the problems we encountered. With all of that information, here are the results we have. And then, it's up to the client to do the best they can with those results. But like I said, it's not okay to say, well, that sample's not perfect, so let's not do anything with it. So when you're dealing with this, with social research in general, there's always this kind of a compromise. There's a trade-off between how good of information can we actually get and how much time we have, how much money we have, and how much we need to act on that information now. We get the best information we can, and we try and make it as useful as possible. And again, all of that comes back to sampling. There are other elements. Your questions have to be good. Your moderators have to be good. If you're doing statistics, your survey has to be done well. Your questions and your math all has to be good. But in the end, you're still saying this is the best information we have. Can we actually do something with this? So